Imagine this. You're 65 years old. You've worked your entire life, paid taxes, raised a family, maybe even served your country. Now you're standing at a government counter applying for retirement benefits. The clerk looks at you and asks a simple question. Can you prove how old you are? You smile. Of course you can. You know your birthday. Your family celebrated it every year. But then the clerk asks for your birth certificate, and suddenly there's a problem. You don't have one. In fact, no birth certificate was ever created for you. So now, after living an entire lifetime, you have to prove that the story of your own birth is true. Sounds impossible, right? Well, for millions of Americans, this wasn't some imaginary nightmare. It was real. Because for a huge part of American history, being born didn't automatically mean the government knew you existed. And the strange story of how that changed involves factory children, deadly diseases, family secrets, government power, and one surprising truth about identity that most of us never think about. Let's go back, not to a government office, but to an old family Bible. Before birth certificates became normal, many American families recorded births by hand. Someone, usually a parent or grandparent, would open the family Bible and write down the child's name, then the date, maybe the time, and that was it. No official seal, no registration number, no computer database, just ink on paper. If the family attended church, there might also be a baptism record. A minister could write down when the child was baptized. But here's the catch. A baptism date wasn't always a birth date. A baby might be baptized days, weeks, or even months later. And plenty of children were never entered into church records at all. So how did people prove their age? Honestly, they asked someone who remembered. A parent might testify. A midwife might confirm the delivery. An elderly neighbor might say, "Yes, I remember. That child was born during the terrible winter." Your identity wasn't stored in a government system. It lived in other people's memories. And in a small town, that could work surprisingly well. Everyone knew your parents. They knew where you lived. They'd watched you grow up. But America didn't stay small. People moved west. Towns became cities. Millions of immigrants arrived from overseas. Factories pulled strangers into crowded industrial neighborhoods. Suddenly, the people around you didn't know your story. And when nobody knew your past, how could anyone confirm it? That's when an old informal system began to crack. The U.S. government had counted people since the first national census in 1790. But counting people wasn't the same as documenting every individual birth. Early census workers traveled from place to place, gathering basic information about households. Their goal was to calculate population, representation, and political power. They weren't building a complete identity file for every American. That meant the government could know roughly how many people lived in a region without knowing exactly when each person had been born. And for a while, that wasn't considered a major problem. Most people didn't need to show identification every few weeks. There were no online accounts to verify, no airport security lines, no modern driver's licenses. If your community accepted who you were, that was usually enough. But then America industrialized, and everything changed. Picture a textile mill around the beginning of the 20th century. The machines are enormous, the noise is deafening, the air is thick with dust. Now look closer. Some of the workers are children, not 17-year-olds, children who look 8, 9, or 10. They worked in mills, mines, factories, farms, and workshops. Some crawled through spaces too narrow for adults. Others stood beside dangerous machinery for hours. Reformers were horrified. They pushed states to establish minimum working ages. If a child had to be at least 14 to work, the law should have protected younger children. Simple, right? Not exactly. Because how do you prove that a child is 12 instead of 14? Ask the parents. Many poor families depended on their children's wages. If changing a child's age meant food on the table, some parents had a powerful reason to lie. Ask the employer. Cheap labor benefited the factory. Ask the child. The child might not know or might have been told exactly what to say. Some families presented sworn statements, others used Bible entries or church records, but those records could be incomplete, incorrect, or even altered. The law had discovered its biggest weakness. You can't enforce an age limit if nobody can reliably prove age. That's when birth registration became more than paperwork. It became a way to protect children. If a record was created immediately after birth and preserved by an independent office, it would be much harder to change years later. But child labor wasn't the only crisis pushing America toward birth certificates. Another threat was hiding inside crowded cities: disease. As urban populations exploded, many families lived in cramped neighborhoods with unsafe water, poor ventilation, and limited medical care. Babies were dying at frightening rates. Doctors and reformers wanted to understand why, but they couldn't calculate the real infant mortality rate unless they knew two numbers: how many babies had died and how many had been born. Death records without accurate birth records told only half the story. Was one neighborhood unusually dangerous? Was clean water reducing deaths? Were new health programs actually working? Without reliable numbers, officials were guessing. So birth records gained a second purpose. They didn't just prove identity, they helped reveal public health disasters that individual stories couldn't show. One family losing a baby was a tragedy. Hundreds of families losing babies in the same district was evidence, and evidence could force authorities to act. Now, you might assume the federal government simply created one national birth certificate system, but that's not what happened. Birth registration was mainly handled by states and local governments. Federal officials could recommend a standard form. They could establish guidelines and encourage states to report compatible information, but they couldn't instantly force every community to participate. So the system developed unevenly. Cities with hospitals and established public health departments often improved registration faster. Remote communities had a harder time. Many babies were still delivered at home by relatives or midwives. A government office might be miles away. Roads could be terrible. Forms could be confusing. And sometimes registering the birth simply didn't feel urgent. After all, the baby was right there. Everyone could see that the child existed. Why should a distant office need to know? That attitude made sense at the time. But years later, the missing record could create enormous problems. And those problems didn't affect everyone equally. Poor families were more likely to live far from hospitals and official offices. Black Americans, especially those born during or soon after slavery, often faced missing, inaccessible, or incomplete records. Rural residents, migrants, and marginalized communities were also more likely to fall through the cracks. The system promised equal recognition, but access to that recognition was never completely equal. Then, during the 1930s, a massive federal program made proof of age far more important: Social Security. Retirement benefits were connected to age. That meant older Americans had to show when they'd been born, but many of them had entered the world decades before reliable birth registration reached their communities. Think about the tension here. The government was asking people for a document that often hadn't existed when they were born. What were they supposed to do? They had to rebuild their own beginnings. Some searched church archives. Some brought old census entries. Some found school records, insurance papers, or marriage documents. Others opened family Bibles and hoped the faded writing would be accepted. And if those records weren't enough, they searched for witnesses: an older sibling, a cousin, a family friend, anyone who could swear that the birth had really happened when the applicant said it had. Using this collection of evidence, officials could issue what was known as a delayed birth certificate, a birth record created years or even decades after the actual event. Birth certificates were supposed to replace unreliable memories with official facts. Yet when older Americans needed delayed certificates, the government often had to rely on the same things the new system was designed to replace: family stories, Bible entries, church books, and human memory. The modern document didn't completely erase the old system. It was built on top of it. But an even bigger change had taken place. Before standardized records, your identity belonged mainly to you, your family, and your community. After registration, the government held an official version of your beginning, your legal name, your birth date, your birthplace, your parents. One misspelled name could follow you for decades. One incorrect date could conflict with every other document, and one missing record could leave you fighting to prove something you knew was true. The birth certificate made people visible to institutions. That visibility could protect them. It could keep children out of factories, support citizenship claims, reveal health emergencies, and unlock retirement benefits. But it also gave institutions greater power to decide which version of your story was legally accepted. That's the trade. Protection and control, printed on the same page. Today, most Americans rarely think about their birth certificates. The document sits inside a drawer, folder, safe, or filing cabinet. Most of the time, it does nothing. Then one day, you need a passport, a license, government benefits, school enrollment, or another official document. Suddenly, that piece of paper becomes the bridge between your physical life and your legal identity. And that leaves us with one uncomfortable question. Does a birth certificate prove you exist? Not really. You existed before anyone completed the form. You cried before the ink dried. Your family knew you before a clerk entered your name into a register. What the certificate actually proves is something different. It proves that an institution recognizes a specific story about your beginning, a name, a place, a date, an official version of you. America didn't simply invent a better way to record births. It changed where society placed its trust. Once, truth lived in families, churches, midwives, and neighbors. Then it moved into files, certificates, and government archives. Today, it's moving again, into digital databases that most of us will never see. The technology keeps changing, but the mystery remains. You know who you are. Your family knows who you are. But when the world demands proof, who gets the final word? You, the people who remember you, or the system holding the record?